Welcome. My name is Emily, and I work on events at the Ann Arbor District Library, and I am absolutely thrilled today to discuss the new anthology that just came out, Queer Nature, a Poetry Anthology, edited by Michael Walsh. And so I have the editor and 3 contributing authors with me here today. So we're going to get into a discussion about what is queer nature? How does it show up in poetry? What is the nature of poetry and queerness? All these amazing, lovely topics. But before I do, I want to just briefly introduce our authors. So first, Tamiko Beyer is the author of the poetry collections We Come Elemental and Last Days. And so Last Days is currently a Lambda Literary finalist. Both collections are from Alice James Books. Joy Ladin is the author of 9 books of poetry, including the just released Shekinah Speaks and the Book of Anna, recently reissued, as well as 2 Lambda Literary Award finalist collections, Impersonations and Transmigrations. Amber Flora Thomas is the author of Eye of Water Poems, which was selected by Harriet Mullen as, excuse me, as the winner of the Kabekanam Poetry Prize for a first book by a Black writer of African descent. Her other poetry books include The Rabbits Could Sing from the University of Alaska Press and Red Channel in the Rupture from Red Hen Press. And Michael Walsh is the editor of Queer Nature and the author of 2 poetry collections, The Dirt Riddles from University of Arkansas Press and Creep Love from Autumn House Press, for which he's currently a Lambda Literary finalist. So I'm going to hand things over to Michael to get our discussion started today.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm delighted to have this anthology out, and I'm really excited to start to talk about queer nature and what this concept means to so many different people. I don't believe that there's any one single definition of queer nature. I'm hopeful that folks listening to us today will have their own ideas about it, and that the ideas we'll talk about today will contribute to everyone's understanding. And I want to open our talk today with a poem, and Amber has offered to read a poem by Mary Oliver that many people know, but that might mean something different to all of us in this discussion who are listening. And Amber, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to read Mary Oliver's poem, Wild Geese. Here we go. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies, and the deep trees, the mountains, and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clear blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
So many wonderful lines in there.
Yeah. For me, I was excited to be able to read this this poem. I often give this poem, to my students on the very first day of class. And I do that because I really, I want it to be an invitation to everyone in the room. But there's a word here that's really important to me as we start this conversation about queer nature and poetry, which is that word imagination, which seems so key here in helping us sort of like unpack the way in which maybe poetry is the vehicle for this exploration. So anyway, I just thought I would start by saying that. So I'm sure other people have other things they want to say, but yeah.
I don't think I've ever felt that poem the way I did when you read it, Amber. I want to thank you for reading it that way. It sort of felt like it was unfolding in me. And that gave rise to sort of a couple of maybe cantankerous sounding remarks, but it's just because it felt like it was happening inside me. One was the soft animal of your body giving into what it wants. That is not about the trans experience as I've known it. Right? So being trans is having a sense of self that is in some ways often at odds with the body that we're given, or at least the interpretations that we're given of the body that we're given, but it's hard to separate our experience of our bodies from those interpretations. And then the other thing, so that was the way I was resisting it, but a way that I was embracing it is that poem seems to me to dissolve the idea of the queer, non-queer binary, or queer straight binary, right? Because it seems confident that every single reader has this kind of loneliness, has this kind of wildness, and has, most importantly, as Amber pointed out, this kind of imagination.
I think that this poem is a great introduction to the rest of what we can talk about, primarily for these reasons. Queer nature is really contradictory. And I don't think that any single poem represents anyone. And I love the way that you've framed this, Joy, because the poem does have a feeling of opening up really to the entire world. But that frame may be too wide and too generous for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate how, in its totally open nature, it leaves out some people. And it leads to more discussion. So I'm wondering then, what would each of us perhaps think about queer nature? If any of us might have a definition or things that we think about, how would any of us phrase those things? And I don't mind starting, but if someone else would like to say a few things, I don't mind it if others go first. I can go for it then. I don't mind jumping in.
I mean, I don't mind jumping in either, but I don't want to dominate. And it feels like I really feel that this poem by Jess X. Snow in the anthology Queer Earth really captures what I really want to say about queer nature. But why don't you start, Michael? So,
well, this is how I think about queer nature. When I think about what it means overall, I think that exploring queer nature has to do with opening up a space for all of the varieties of queer and trans folks in all of their expressions. And I don't think that there's any one poem that can encapsulate it. I don't think there's any single identity that can encapsulate all varieties either. And I like to think about how queer nature relates to biodiversity in particular. When I think about the world around us and I learn about all of the flora and fauna that coexist with us in the world, I notice that all of the genders and orientations that we might project onto them are incorrect, that they break down, and that straight nature in particular, I would suggest that maybe it doesn't exist, or it is too much of a cookie cutter concept to apply onto the world. And also that queer nature might be best thought of as more permissive, communal, adaptive, all of that in relation to straight nature. So Joy, I hope I'm getting at some of the things that you brought up right away that I think are really important to talk about.
Yes, you definitely are, but I'm hesitant to follow up yet. I thought I saw Tamiko thinking things, and I wanted to hear what she was thinking, and I was wondering, Amber wanted to offer some capsule definition of what she's thinking, or maybe a chunk of the poem to help us. And so,
thanks, Joy. Yeah, I was thinking. Well, and I was thinking, kind of to follow up on what you were saying, Michael, and also Joy. One of the things that I've been thinking about in preparing for this panel is I was recently doing a meditation circle with a group of other BIPOC people, and somebody brought in a lesson that they had learned in another retreat, I think, and that was that instead of thinking of ourselves as humans walking on the earth, to think of ourselves, or that we actually are earth walking. And that was such a beautiful concept that has stuck with me for a while now. And it makes me think that because I am earth walking and I am queer, earth is queer and nature is queer. And because straight people are earth walking, earth is straight and nature is straight. And actually these concepts of queer and straight are really, I think, kind of, as you were referencing, Michael, they're false binaries. They're not to say that they don't exist, but that they're concepts that have been put upon us by white colonialism and capitalism, that there's this kind of categorization that I think racial capitalism wants to do. And I think really the essence for me of queer nature is to resist those categorizations and insistence on definition, to like merge and to be undefinable in a way. And for me, that is really how I feel into queer nature.
I was interested in sharing Snow's poem only because she makes this point in there about the sort of the beginning of life on Earth. This idea that we were once a single cell that then split and then split again, and that so we sort of come from this origin of this. There is no like gender, there's just this sort of evolving from one place, and so gender is really a construct of our current time. So that's kind of, how I think of it. I also, was, thinking that there's a definite reason for, for what a need for the anthology, right? A need for this conversation and a need for moving into poetry to talk about, what is queer nature and to sort of explore it, sort of why we move towards it. And I think that I think it, like, in a very simple way, that, the root is that we exist, in all of our various, diversities and bodies and experiences. And therefore, we're here and we need to keep, speaking about it, keep moving from, through that place of imagination to imagine, what our living looks like, here. But also it's this effort to continue to articulate, of course, through creative works, what beauty is and what body is, and some of. Yeah. So, I mean, so really, I kept, as I was thinking about this panel, I kept coming back to, this conversation and the value of needing to write about queerness and poetry. So yeah, those are a few of my points.
So far, I feel like there's a kind of a harmonizing of the ways that we're thinking about this. And I wanted to follow up on a piece of it about binaries. So I think that, you know, racism and capitalism should be blamed for pretty much anything we can think of blaming anything for. But binaries are a human nature thing. They're a cognitive response to complexity and anxiety, both. So sometimes we use binaries because we're overwhelmed by complexity and we want to simplify things. For example, when Jews try to figure out who's a Jew, that is a very complicated question, and some people they just kind of melt down with it, and they say, well, look, you know, there are Jews and there are non-Jews, and that's a way of managing things. You can draw the line wherever you want to, but there has to be a line, and somebody's got to be on the other side of that line, or you don't have any sense of identity. Anxiety, we also often respond to with binary thinking, because it simplifies things in a way that makes us feel like we have control over them. You know, there are two kinds of people: good people and bad people, or binary people and non-binary people, or queer and straight people. It gives us a sense that we can master the complexity around us, which is why it doesn't have anything to do with the actual world. The world of nature, as Michael was saying, there's no binaries there. Even within species that have sexual dimorphism, there are also variants that are as natural or inevitable as anything else. And so binary thinking is something that it is a human act of imagination. There can be better and worse ways to use your imagination. But I don't want to trash binaries in and of themselves. I just want to say that whenever we're seeing things in a binary way, we're seeing in a human constructed, socially constructed, imaginatively projected way, rather than experiencing the overflowing richness of ourselves or the world or human society, whatever it is, where we've decided that's too much for us, so we just want to see whatever can fit into two boxes.
Joy, I would also like to add that I think that fear and anxiety, particularly the kind that we've been experiencing for the last several years, also locks us into those binaristic codes, that way of seeing. And for me, queer nature also has to do with lowering those fears, lowering those anxieties, so that we aren't stuck seeing each other in this inherently oppositional way that's built right into our brains. It's all in cognitive psychology too. So that's what came up for me automatically when you were talking. And I'll thank the psychologists I've worked with in the past for that bit of insight. I'm wondering if we're ready for another poem, though. And Joy, would you like to read Jean Jordan's poem that you had mentioned?
Yeah, that's great, because this is a very subversive use of queer nature that goes along with what we're saying is nature standing in for what escapes social ordering and regulation. Letter to the local police. Dear Sirs, I have been enjoying the law and order of our community throughout the past 3 months since my wife and I, our 2 cats, and miscellaneous photographs of the 6 grandchildren belonging to our previous neighbors, with whom we were very close, arrived in Saratoga Springs, which is clearly prospering under your custody. Indeed, until yesterday afternoon, and despite my vigilant casting about, I have been unable to discover a single instance of reasons for public-spirited concern, much less complaint. You may easily appreciate, then, how it is that I write to your office at this date with utmost regret for the lamentable circumstances that force my hand. Speaking directly to the issue of the moment, I have encountered a regular profusion of certain unidentified roses, growing to no discernible purpose and according to no perceptible control, approximately 1/4 mile west of the Northway on the southern side. To be specific, there are practically thousands of the aforementioned abiding in perpetual near riot of wild behavior, indiscriminate coloring, and only the good Lord himself can say what diverse soliciting of promiscuous cross-fertilization. As I say, these roses, no matter what the apparent background, training, tropistic tendencies, age, or color, do not demonstrate the least inclination toward categorization, specialized allegiance, resolute preference, consideration of the needs of others, or any other minimal traits of decency. May I point out that I did not assiduously seek out this colony, as it were, and that these certain unidentified roses remain open to viewing even by children, with or without suitable supervision. My wife asks me to append a note as regards the seasonal but nevertheless seriously licentious phenomenon of honeysuckle under the moon that one may apprehend at the corner of Nelson and Main. I am confident that you will devise and pursue appropriate legal response to the roses in question. If I may aid your efforts in this respect, please do not hesitate to call me into consultation. Respectfully yours.
I enjoy all of those unidentified roses that we get to hear about, their rebellion and their loveliness.
And it's so funny, but it's so true. It really is. Yeah, and it just makes me think of getting back to that question of queer nature. Some of the words that I wrote down, and then I saw you mention this poem, Joy, but I had written down like effusion, abundance, randomness, happenstance, purposelessness. And then I recalled that poem by June Jordan. Yeah.
And that's like a very timely poem, but it's always a timely poem. But just at this particular moment, the reference to children seeing things without supervision seems particularly apropos, particularly for libraries, right? Because now the shelves of libraries have become the roses blooming without discrimination that children need to be protected from.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, lots of rhetoric in lots of different places. Yeah, fortunately, our library hasn't really come under those kinds of attacks. But yeah, just so many. It's like, think of the children, but it's like, well, are you thinking of all children, though, when you're passing these laws and when you're banning these books? And yeah.
And I think there are so many kids out there who don't get enough information about their bodies, about their own potential orientations. I love this poem because it speaks to all of it. And I hope that the queer nature work leads directly to kids. I really do hope that. And I'm thinking very hard about how to make that happen. Mm-hmm. Regarding June's poem, does anything else come to mind for folks that you might want to talk about within any of the lines or ideas that it brings up for you?
I mean, I guess one thing that I'm thinking about is I think, you know, in this poem, the roses do stand in, I think, for queer folks, but I think also very much for Black folks. It just, you know, I don't know when she wrote this poem, but it just feels like a kind of calling out of this the safety that white straight communities want to live under, and where anything outside and deviant, or what they perceive as deviant, it's like immediately reported to the police. And so I also read it as an abolition poem as well. And I feel like abolition is very much part and parcel of queer nature as well. So yeah, those were some of the things that rose to my mind in reading that poem.
I had the same thought that, ultimately, a part of that poem is most definitely about possible laws that were still on the books that would not allow Blacks and whites to marry at that time. And I'm not positive that all those laws are gone. In fact, some of them haven't been removed from the books in various states, but I have a feeling that that poem was also conversing with those politics there.
And I was thinking about all the people arrested for having barbecues or laughing or, sleeping in a library, jogging, get arrested or murdered, like there's yeah.
It's a queer nature poem and it remains completely contemporary. I think it's just a magnificent poem. I'm wondering if anyone happened to think about flora and fauna around them at this time in their community, anything that they've seen blooming or moving about in the wild now, anything that might be part of the conversation today. And I don't know if anyone's been outside that much. I admit I've been at my computer a lot, but I wanted to open up the space for any observations about this too that might relate to the anthology or how we're talking about queer and trans lives. Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate? So Joy put in the chat, Iris are queer AF.
I can jump in. I have been I live on the land of the Massachusetts people, currently known as Boston, and winters are very long and very cold here, and so spring has finally arrived in the last few weeks, and I've been going outside a lot, and I live right next to the Neponset River, and which is where I am. The Neponset River is running into the bay, and so it's an estuary. It's a tidal river, so the tides rise and fall. And there are a couple of geese who make their nest in a very precarious place every year, where because the river rises and falls, we are often worried that their nest will be drowned by the river, but they usually manage to survive, and the goslings usually manage to survive, and there's 4 of them this year that have hatched and survived. And one of the things I was thinking when Michael, you sent us that question, was how there are the 2 parent geese who are the kind of main caretakers of them, but then there's like a whole, I would say like 4 or 5 other geese who are part of the community, who basically guard the goslings. If they're like on the path eating the grass, there's like 5 or 6 adult geese kind of around, making sure that humans don't get close. And I've just really, like, in all my years of observing the waterfowl here on the river, this like it really does feel like a community affair in terms of raising the babies. And I feel like that is very much around like queer family. One of my great joys about being queer, one of the things that I value most is how we have our chosen family and how it often looks so different from the nuclear family, and how, you know, there's like aunties and uncles and, you know, siblings and, you know, like everyone kind of comes together and forms families in a way that's not necessarily recognizable by straight culture. And I feel like the geese and there's also ducks that do the same thing here that really, really reflect that, I think.
I appreciate the ways in which you see parallels between the human and the more than human worlds. I think there are a lot of different parallels that each of us see too. And I think that they're fairly individual rather than being something that we share universally. I'll mention a couple things that are going on in my own landscape. We recently relocated to a valley in Southwest Wisconsin. This is understood to be traditionally Ho-Chunk land, though the truth of the land we live now is really more varied than that, and that a lot of different indigenous people made their way to here because there was a river crossing nearby. So the specific space is more varied than, I think, a single claim of ownership. But what's going on here is that the trees and the flowers are all beginning to bloom. And the way that I see the flowers and the trees has to do with all of their different flowers and their cones and the varied genders that they all seem to have. In my intro for Queer Nature, I talked about how flowers are monoecious, separate male and female flowers on the same tree, but there's actually even more variety than that. And some trees are co-sexual with male and female parts in the same flower. Others are polygamous with male, female, and co-sexual flowers all on the same tree. And what I like to think about when I walk outside is how all of this sex is happening around me. It's all there, floating, happening everywhere around me. It's really not heterosexual in any way that I can see. Maybe for someone's framework it is, but I see it differently. I just take enjoyment in that when I go outside. And one of the things that I've tried to live is to attempt to change my perceptions as much as possible so that when I look out at the world, I stop seeing the straight nature that I was taught to believe in, and I start to be able to see some glimmerings or shimmerings of the way the world is living with its gender and its sexual reproduction.
I think that is such a beautiful perspective to have, and I'm going to try to cultivate it, but my perception of nature is so dim. It's highly unlikely that I'll get there. Maybe a little shimmer at a distance. But I just wanted to add a little footnote that I think it's important from a trans perspective, but maybe whenever we talk about queer nature, to distinguish between sex, means of reproduction, and gender, which is an interpretation. I don't know any other creatures other than human beings that interpret their physical forms. In other words, they're not just being co-sexual, but they're thinking, oh, I identify as a co-sexual. And as a co-sexual, I'm going to make sure that I have more leaves on this side than I do on that side, because, otherwise nobody will recognize that I'm a co-sexual. Think I'm a DVD co-sexual or something. So I try to be very careful about using the word gender and keeping it in the realm of interpretation. Mine as well as, non-trans people. I just think it's all stuff that we think about ourselves rather than stuff that we are.
Thank you for that clarification. I agree. It's really important to keep that fully in mind. Amber, do you have anything from your landscape you'd like to share?
Yeah, well, just in regards to the conversation that's going on, I feel like I'm still learning. I'm learning all the time from my students and from every person that I encounter, because there's just so much diversity in how we view our bodies and our lives and our relationships and such. And so I think that we're in this moment where we're really like learning to to pay attention to our assumptions. And I'm just really hoping that this isn't just happening in academia, which is where I live most of my life, it seems like. But I was embarrassed to share my story, because I live in a place where there's a lot of animals that are neglected. I live in Eastern North Carolina. It's the poorest part of North Carolina, and it's very rural and wild here. And I'm constantly rescuing animals. And I recently rescued a kitten I found on the side of the road. It was actually running down the side of the road. And he is in my care right now, but he is about to go get shipped to New Hampshire to be adopted. But my dog has been helping me take care of this kitten who, when I rescued him, hadn't been weaned yet. So she took it upon herself to teach him and help him wean. She went through the process. She's never had puppies, but somehow I watched this unfold between the two of them and saw very clearly that she taught him that he didn't need to nurse anymore. So I did watch that unfold in front of me, and it was very strange, and it's embarrassing to admit too that was going on in the house. But she helped me raise this little beast. I think that so in my world, nature continues to be a refuge for me, a place that I go for. I have my home now, and so I have lots of safety around me, but I don't know. I feel like where I'm coming from in this conversation is very much just still kind of as a person who is still kind of working through some of my own issues from my early years, in terms of like just being appreciative of being able to go into wild places. And I use the word wild hesitantly there, because I don't think there's very much wilderness left in the world, but to go into those quiet places for a kind of refuge. So, so this is, to me, I keep coming back. I can't wait to put my hands on this anthology when my copy comes through, because I felt such relief in reading I read most of the work, wasn't able to read it deeply. I will read it 2 or 3 times before I feel that I really kind of digested it. But this anthology is just so important to me, because it feels like it's the first time I'm reading these collective voices, to sort of hear from all of these people coming from all these different places with different experiences. And so, I'm feeling a little less alone through what I've read of the anthology so far. And, just so really appreciative of its existence here in the world. So I don't know, we haven't really talked about that, but I'm sure that some folks who might be enjoying our talk might want to know why they should pick this up. And I think they're going to be blown away by the voices in there and the people included, because I have a feeling that they're going to have the experience of maybe not really understanding the queer nature of the poets that maybe they've been reading for years. So I think they're going to, be moved and surprised by some of the people you've collected here, some of the poets you've collected here. So those are some of my thoughts right at this moment, but unfortunately I'm not necessarily rising to the level of some of the points that have been made. So,
Amber, could I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
This is a big book. When you get it, you'll see it's like a potential murder object. And so, not that I'm recommending anybody use it that way, but people who for whom this is new may wonder, how do they find their way into this book? The poets are arranged in alphabetical order, and I agree with you that I think that this is important for a lot of very different people, including people who are not accustomed to, the Norton Anthology of Poetry, and no problem. So do you have any ideas for how folks who don't have their own anthology habits might approach this?
So what I did was I started with poets whose names I recognized, and I started reading sort of outward from there. You're welcome to start at the beginning and read to the end, but sometimes with an anthology, especially when it's organized alphabetically, it can be just enjoyable to read around and just thumb through it, or but just read around. But that's a really good question, because it is so massive. Honestly, I don't have a good suggestion for someone who is not familiar maybe with poetry, because again, for me, I was really kind of reading outward from the writers that I was familiar with, so I could and read around those writers. Anyway, I don't know. Does someone else have a good? That's a really good question. How do you approach a really massive anthology? I've done it both ways. I've read around and just sort of picked a spot and kind of moved from there, and and just kind of seen where it's led me. But I've also read from the beginning to the end, and I've enjoyed both of those approaches.
Joy, I appreciate you mentioning this, because I didn't want to arrange the anthology in any kind of hierarchical order. There was simply no way to do it, and I didn't feel that it was in the spirit of the works collected. I like to read the anthology through lateral metaphors, actually, which is very nerdy. But I like to read them in terms of things like trees and rivers and water. And that's a way that my mind tends to organize things. But that's only one of many ways I think that you could enter all these poems and work your way through them. Mm-hmm. And I think that as the anthology gets out there in the world, there will be more conversations like this, where we end up talking about gender and sex in particular, and what the differences are between the two. I think that they're words that we often fumble over really easily, no matter who we are. And I think it's important that everyone figure out how to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And I see that we're getting close to the end of our time. So I'd really like to, I hope now is a good time to transition to Tamiko, so that you can read your poem too.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this is my poem in the anthology, and it's called Creatures of Hurt and Heal. Creatures of Hurt and Heal. Let go, says the hawk. Let go, says the dirt. Let go, say the vines that wrap tight to become protective skin. Become another heart beating counter rhythm. Become an extra spleen for mysterious functions of filter. A month ago, light balanced on the edge of dark and equal distribution. We lifted our palms up. Now we move slowly toward the solstice. Then we will move slowly away. The branches are thin, dark, newly liberated from their leaves. The flash in the morning fog might be a cardinal or a siren in the distance, a marking of this world where light is something we calibrate closely. I have come into 40 softer than at 20, stronger than at 30. The world's injustice clashing with my deepest convictions. Every day I do the only work I know, small shifts in the balance of power. Again and again, hard and joyful, the only way toward change. Every night I kiss the woman I can't get enough of. We move toward the sun and away from the sun, toward light and away from light, elliptical, steady, bound and unbound.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I just want to elaborate. So for folks who are watching this for the Ann Arbor District Library, we will have this in the collection, right? So when this airs, it will be June, and you should be able to put yourself on the hold list for this book. This amazing anthology of, I think, maybe 300, almost 300 people. But thank you so much for just this, even just this tiny little dip into all of the many, many ideas that this anthology brings up. Just the richness is incredible.
Thank you for hosting us, Emily.
Thank you so much. This is lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.